There's an old saying in the Montana Territory that the sweetest roses often have the sharpest thorns. In the bustling town of Sweetwater Junction, no one embodied this truth more than Sarah Mitchell, though not a soul in town suspected it. To the good folks of Sweetwater, she was simply the miracle worker behind the Morning Star Bakery, whose sourdough bread and honey-glazed pastries could make even the most hardened trail boss smile. But 10 years ago, in places where outlaws gathered and lawmen spoke in whispers, she'd been known by a different name. Sweet Sarah Hawkins, the fastest gun west of the Mississippi, with 27 notches on her pearl-handled Colt, and a reputation that made even Jake the Snake McGraw think twice about drawing iron. Join me as we explore the story of the woman who traded her gun belt for an apron, and how fate forced her to prove that while flour might coat her hands now, they hadn't forgotten the feel of blued steel. If you're new to our channel, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story about the ghost rider of Yellow Rock Canyon will chill you to the bone. Sweetwater Junction, spring of 1875, was experiencing one of those perfect Montana mornings, where the sun painted the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold. The town had grown significantly in the past few years, thanks to the silver strike in the nearby mountains and the railroad spur that connected it to the main line. The Morning Star Bakery sat at the corner of Main and Silver Streets, its blue-painted door and whitewashed walls as cheerful as its owner's smile. Inside, Sarah Mitchell worked with the same precision she'd once used to fan a Colt 45. Her movements were elegant and efficient as she shaped loaves of bread, never a motion wasted. The sleeves of her white blouse were rolled up, showing forearms dusted with flour rather than the gunpowder residue of her past. Her dark hair, once worn wild and free during her riding days, was now neatly pinned back beneath a clean white cap. Sheriff Tom Hawley, enjoying his morning coffee and one of Sarah's famous cinnamon rolls, watched her work with admiration. "Don't know how you do it, Miss Sarah," he said, brushing crumbs from his silver mustache. "Been eating these rolls for 3 years now, and they still taste like a little piece of heaven." Sarah's smile was gentle, hiding years of memories that would have shocked a good sheriff. "The secret's in the timing, Sheriff, just like anything else in life." She'd said those exact words about gunfighting once to a young deputy in Dodge City who'd asked for advice. The irony wasn't lost on her. The morning crowd at the bakery was just starting to thin when Wesley Cooper burst through the door, his young face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff! Sheriff Hawley! Riders coming in from the east. Looks like the Carson gang!" The sheriff's hand instinctively moved to his gun. The Carson gang had been terrorizing the territory for months, leaving a trail of robbed banks and grieving widows from Butte to Bozeman. "How many?" 8, maybe 10, Wesley panted. Jake Carson himself's leading them. Sarah's hands stilled in their work, though none noticed the subtle change in her posture. Jake Carson, she knew that name. 8 years ago, she'd seen him. Gunned down a young marshal in cold blood in Abilene. She'd been tracking him when the incident that led to her retirement occurred. Sheriff Hawley stood, his breakfast forgotten. "Miss Sarah, best lock up. Things might get ugly." He headed for the door, already calling for his deputy. Sarah watched him go, her expression unchanged, but her mind racing. Behind the counter, beneath the flour bins and rolling pins, lay a wooden box she hadn't opened in 10 years. Inside rested her Colt, its pearl grips still pristine, wrapped in an oiled cloth alongside a gun belt that had seen more action than most. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder on the street outside. Sarah Mitchell, once Sweet Sarah Hawkins, continued kneading her dough with steady hands, even as her past came thundering toward her present. The peaceful life she'd built in Sweetwater Junction was about to collide with the violent world she'd left behind, and she knew better than most that some things, like the perfect loaf of bread or a lightning-fast draw, once learned, are never truly forgotten. The storm was coming to Sweetwater Junction, and with it, secrets long buried were about to rise with the morning's fresh bread. Jake Carson's reputation had grown since Sarah last laid eyes on him in Abilene. The young hothead who'd gunned down Marshal Peters had evolved into something far more dangerous, a calculating predator who planned his raids with military precision. Through her bakery window, Sarah watched the gang ride into town, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that danced in the morning light. Carson rode point on a coal-black stallion, his silver-trimmed saddle gleaming in the sun. He'd aged well, she noted with professional detachment. The boyish features had hardened into sharp angles, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a snake sizing up its prey. Behind him, his men spread out with practiced efficiency, veterans, all not the common thugs most gangs employed. Miss Sarah. Young Mary Cooper tugged at her apron, her small face pinched with worry. The 12-year-old often helped at the bakery after school, earning pocket money and free cookies. Pa says we should hide in the cellar. Sarah smiled, keeping her voice steady. Your father's right, dear. But first, help me get these loaves in the oven. Can't let good dough go to waste. Even as she spoke, her mind was cataloguing details. With the precision that had once made her legendary, 2 men covering the north end of the street, 3 watching the south. Carson and his lieutenant, a scarred giant she didn't recognize, dismounting in front of the bank. Sheriff Hawley and his deputy, young Bill Turner, stood their ground in front of the bank's wooden steps. Sarah could read the fear in Turner's stance. He'd never faced anything worse than drunk cowboys before today. Hawley, though, carried himself well. Sometimes experience counted more than speed. "Morning, gentlemen," Carson's voice carried clearly through the spring air, smooth as creek water over stones. "Beautiful day for banking, wouldn't you say?" "Town's closed for business, Carson," Hawley replied, his hand resting near his gun. "Best ride on." The outlaw's laugh was genuine, which made it all the more chilling. "Now, Sheriff, is that any way to treat paying customers? Why, Miss Abigail at the Golden Rose Saloon speaks very highly of Sweetwater's hospitality." Sarah's hands stilled in their work. "Abigail, of course." The saloon owner had arrived 6 months ago, all smiles and business sense. She should have recognized the woman's 2 careful questions about the town's security for what they were. "Last warning," Hawley stood his ground. "Turn around and ride out." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Sheriff. See, we've got expenses to meet. But I'm a reasonable man. Surrender your guns now, and nobody needs to get hurt. Resist." Carson shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. In the bakery, Sarah guided Mary toward the cellar stairs. "Down you go, child. Don't come up until someone fetches you." She watched the girl descend before turning to her other customers, Mrs. Henderson from the millinery shop and old Mr. Peters, who ran the telegraph office. "You too, if you please. Plenty of space down there." Once they were safely below, Sarah moved to the back room. The wooden box lay exactly where it had for 10 years, gathering dust beneath bags of flour. Her hands didn't shake as she lifted it. They never had, not even during that last gunfight in Dodge City. The oiled cloth fell away, revealing the Colt's pearl grips, still pristine after all these years. Outside, the confrontation was reaching its climax. "One more chance, Sheriff." Carson's voice had lost its humor. "Don't make me do something we'll both regret." Sarah checked the cylinder, 6 rounds, still pristine. She'd cleaned the gun religiously every month, telling herself it was just habit, not preparation, for this very moment. The familiar weight settled into her palm like a handshake from an old friend. Through the window, she saw Carson's lieutenant's hand drifting toward his gun. The giant's tell was subtle, a slight tension in his left shoulder that most would miss. But Sarah had staked her life on reading such signs 100 times before. In 3 seconds, he would draw. In 4, the bow. Street would erupt in gunfire, and Sheriff Hawley, for all his courage, wouldn't stand a chance against professionals like these. Sarah took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scents of yeast and flour. Her peaceful life in Sweetwater Junction had been sweet, but she'd known. In her heart, it was just a temporary respite. Some debts, like some sins, demand payment eventually. The first shot came exactly as Sarah had predicted. Carson's lieutenant drew with impressive speed, his bullet throwing splinters from the hitching post near Sheriff Hawley's head. The street erupted in gunfire, townspeople scattering like leaves. In a windstorm, as both lawmen dove for cover behind a water trough, Sarah watched through her window as Carson's men maintained disciplined fire, keeping the sheriff and his deputy pinned while their leader and 3 others moved toward the bank's entrance. Their tactics spoke of military training. These weren't common bandits, but experienced killers who'd likely learned their trade during the war. She moved silently through her bakery, muscle memory taking over as she shifted from shadow to shadow. The familiar weight of the gun belt around her hips brought back a flood of memories. Moonlit chases across the Kansas prairie, tense standoffs in crowded saloons, the metallic taste of fear and gun smoke in the air. "Check the buildings," Carson ordered, his voice carrying clearly. "Don't want any heroes getting ambitious with a scattergun." 2 of his men began moving down the boardwalk, methodically clearing each establishment. They were 4 doors away, from the Morning Star Bakery. Sarah positioned herself beside her front window, using the morning glare on the glass to remain unseen while observing the street. Sheriff Hawley was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his return fire becoming increasingly erratic. Deputy Turner looked terrified, but was holding his position, though his ammunition wouldn't last much longer. The bell above her door chimed softly as the first outlaw entered. He moved cautiously, his gun leading the way, a professional's approach. Sarah recognized him from wanted posters. Mike, the Ghost, Matthews, known for his silent kills and specialty in close-quarters combat. "Clear in the front," Matthews called out, moving toward the counter. His boot crunched on fallen sugar as he approached the kitchen doorway. "Anybody home? Just need to make sure you're not planning anything foolish." Sarah stepped out behind him, her voice soft as a winter breeze. "The only foolish thing, Mr. Matthews, was not recognizing my name." The outlaw spun with remarkable speed, but Sarah was already moving. Her left hand knocked his gun arm wide, while her right delivered a precise strike to his throat, a technique she'd learned from a Chinese miner in California. Matthews dropped without a sound, and Sarah caught him before he could crash into her display of fresh pies. She lowered him quietly, retrieving his gun and spare ammunition. "Sorry about the sugar," she whispered, more concerned about the waste of good baking ingredients than the unconscious man at her feet. Outside, the second man was approaching her door. Through the window's reflection, Sarah spotted movement in the millinery shop across the street. More townspeople with guns, waiting for their moment. Their courage was admirable, but their inexperience would get them killed against professionals like Carson's crew. Sarah quickly calculated angles and positions. Carson had 13 men total, 2 down in the initial exchange with Hawley, Matthews unconscious on her floor, 1 approaching her door, 3 in the bank with Carson, and 6 maintaining covering fire. The odds were steep, but she'd faced worse in Dodge City. The bell chimed again as the second outlaw entered. "Matthews, you still checking the kitchen?" He was younger than the first, probably new to the gang, but his gun hand was rock steady as he swept the room. Sarah had positioned herself behind her heavy oak display case, using its brass trim to track his movement in reflection. The young outlaw's eyes widened as he spotted Matthews on the floor, but his shout of warning died in his throat as Sarah's hand clamped over his mouth from behind. "Quiet now," she whispered, the barrel of her Colt pressing against his ribs. "Unless you want to join your friend in taking a nap." She felt him tense, considering resistance, then relax as survival instinct won out. Smart choice. Now you're going to tell me exactly how Carson plans to leave town and which horse has the dynamite in its saddlebags." The young man's eyes widened in surprise, and Sarah allowed herself a small smile. 10 years of retirement hadn't dulled her instincts. She'd spotted the distinctive shape of the saddlebags when they rode in, and Carson's reputation for using explosives as distractions was well known in certain circles. In the street, Carson's voice rose above the gunfire. 5 minutes, boys! Then we introduce these fine folks to some real fireworks." Sarah worked quickly, using spare apron strings to bind and gag her 2 captives. The young outlaw had proved quite informative. Carson planned to use the dynamite as cover for their escape through the narrow canyon east of town, where they had extra horses waiting. It was exactly the kind of detailed planning she'd expect from him. "You're her, aren't you?" the young man whispered as she tightened the last knot. "Sweet Sarah. They said you died in that fire in Dodge." "Sometimes dying's the best way to live," she replied softly, checking Matthews was still unconscious. "Though I have to admit, I miss the simpler things about my old life. Sourdough starter is far more temperamental than any gunslinger I ever met." A fresh volley of gunfire outside drew her attention back to the immediate crisis. Through her window, she could see Carson emerging from the bank, saddlebags bulging with Sweetwater Junction savings. His lieutenant was organizing the covering fire with professional precision, using minimal ammunition for maximum effect. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting old instincts surface. Time seemed to slow as her mind catalogued every detail. The wind direction, the angle of the sun, the precise positions of Carson's men. She'd always had a gift for tactical thinking. It's what had made her legendary before she'd traded her gun for a rolling pin. The memory of that day in Dodge City flashed unbidden through her mind. The fire, the screams, the terrible choice she'd had to make. She'd walked away then, believing that violence only bred more violence. But now, watching Carson's men terrorize her adopted home, she wondered if sometimes peace needed teeth to survive. "Miss Sarah," a whispered voice from the cellar door made her turn. Mary Cooper's small face peered out, eyes wide with worry. "I heard fighting. Is everyone okay?" "Stay down there, child," Sarah ordered gently, moving to block the girl's view of the bound outlaws. "And Mary, whatever you hear, whatever happens, remember that people aren't always what they seem. Sometimes that's a bad thing, like with Miss Abigail at the saloon. But sometimes—" she touched the pearl grip of her Colt. "Sometimes it's what keeps us safe." A crash from the street drew her attention. One of Carson's men had shot out the water tower's support strut, sending a cascade of water flooding down Main Street. The outlaws were creating chaos, making it harder for anyone to interfere with their escape. 3 minutes, Carson shouted to his men. "Get those horses ready." Sarah moved to her back door, mind racing. The Carson gang's reputation wasn't built on brutality but on cunning. They preferred to outsmart lawmen rather than outfight them, which meant she scanned the buildings across the alley. There, movement on the roof of the telegraph office. Carson had men positioned high, ready to provide covering fire during their retreat. It was exactly what she would have done in his place. Sarah checked her Colt one last time, then reached beneath her counter for the Winchester rifle she kept for emergencies. The familiar weight brought back memories of long-range shooting contests with Texas Rangers, of tracking outlaws across the desert guided only by starlight. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered, though whether she was asking forgiveness for what she was about to do or for pretending to be something she wasn't these past 10 years, she couldn't say. From the cellar came the soft sound of Mary singing a hymn, her clear young voice a stark contrast to the violence above. The same hymn had played at Marshal Peter's funeral in Abilene, right before Sarah had first started hunting Carson. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. "Time to earn my keep," she murmured, measuring out a handful of ammunition. Though I suspect business might suffer once folks learn their baker's true specialty isn't just cinnamon rolls. Outside, Carson was gathering his men for the final push. In 2 minutes, they'd make their move for the horses. In 3, the dynamite would explode. And in 4 minutes, Sweetwater Junction would learn why Sweet Sarah Hawkins had been both feared and respected throughout the West. Sarah moved through her bakery's back door like a shadow, the weight of the Winchester comfortable in her hands. The alley behind her shop was quiet, the sounds of gunfire muffled by the buildings. A storm of memories washed over her. Similar alleys in a dozen different towns, where she'd learned that the difference between living and dying often came down to patience and positioning. She spotted her first target immediately, a lookout on the telegraph office roof, so focused on watching the main street that he never thought to check his back. The old Sarah would have shot him without hesitation. The new Sarah, the one who'd spent years teaching children to bake cookies and comforting widows with fresh bread, hesitated for just a moment. "Sorry about this," she whispered, then brought the rifle stock down hard on the back of his head as she emerged silently behind him. He dropped without a sound, and she quickly bound him with his own bandana, one less gun covering Carson's escape. From her new vantage point, she could see the full scope of Carson's plan. 3 men were positioning horses near the bank, while others maintained covering fire. The saddlebag with dynamite was clearly visible on a paint mare, positioned perfectly to create maximum chaos when it exploded. But something about the setup nagged at her instincts. "Too obvious," she murmured, scanning the scene again. Carson was smarter than that. The visible dynamite had to be a decoy, which meant a flicker of movement caught her eye. 2 men, slipping through the back of the livery stable, carrying familiar-looking bags. The real explosives meant to collapse the canyon walls during their escape. Carson always did like to seal off pursuit routes. Below, Sheriff Hawley was running low on ammunition, but his positioning was clever. He'd managed to keep Carson's men focused on him while Deputy Turner worked his way around to the side. Not bad for small-town lawmen, but they were still outmatched. Sarah checked her watch, a delicate timepiece that had been a gift from a grateful banker's wife in Tombstone. Less than 2 minutes until Carson made his move. She needed to act now, but revealing herself would mean the end of her peaceful life in Sweetwater Junction. No more quiet mornings with the smell of fresh bread, no more teaching young Mary Cooper. The secret to perfect pie crust. The decision was made for her when she heard a familiar voice from the street below. "Bring out the girl," Carson shouted. "I know Sweet Sarah's up there somewhere. Come on out, Sarah, or we'll see how well your little apprentice handles fire." Sarah's blood ran cold. Through a gap between buildings, she could see Mary struggling. In the grip of Carson's lieutenant, the giant's face twisted in a cruel smile. "The girl must have tried to sneak out of the cellar to get help. You know what happened in Dodge City, Sarah," Carson continued. "Don't make me repeat history." The words hit her like physical blows. Dodge City, where she'd been forced to choose between saving a child or catching the men who'd killed her family. She'd chosen the child and walked away from her old life. But the guilt had never quite faded. "Times change, Jake," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the street. Several of Carson's men started at the sound, recognizing it from wanted posters and campfire stories. "I'm not the same woman who let you slip away in Abilene." "Prove it," Carson challenged. "Show yourself. Or should I tell everyone how the famous Sweet Sarah let an innocent family burn while she was too busy chasing glory?" Sarah's hands tightened on the Winchester. Carson was trying to bait her into doing something rash, but 10 years of working with temperamental dough had taught her patience. She watched his men's positions, noting their tension, their anticipation. They were waiting for something. Then she saw it, the subtle hand signal from Carson to his men on the roofs. He wasn't just planning to escape. He was setting up a killing field. Once she showed herself, every gun would open up, and the crossfire would catch not just her, but half the town as well. One last chance, Sarah. Carson's voice held a hint of strain now. Or the girl gets a close-up look at our fireworks. Sarah's mind raced as she evaluated her options. Carson's men had the street covered from multiple angles. The real explosives were being moved into position, and young Mary's life hung in the balance. The situation was deteriorating faster than a badly proofed loaf of bread. "You're getting predictable, Jake," she called out, carefully moving to a new position. "Still using children as shields, just like in Abilene. Guess some men never learn new tricks." She caught Mary's eye across the distance and gave the slightest shake of her head, warning the girl to stay still. The child was clever. Sarah had spent enough time teaching her to read subtle signs while baking. A slightly darker crust meant a few more minutes needed. A sharp nod meant time to take the pies out. "Now those lessons might save her life," says the woman hiding behind a rolling pin. Carson laughed, but there was an edge to it. The great sweet Sarah, reduced to baking. "Cookies. Tell me, does the flour help hide the blood on your hands?" The taunt was meant to rattle her, but Sarah had long ago made peace with her past. "Funny thing about baking, Jake," she replied, using her voice to draw attention while she maneuvered. "It teaches you patience, timing, precision, kind of like that shot that took your brother's trigger finger in Dodge." That hit home. She saw Carson's face darken with rage, saw his lieutenant's grip on Mary tighten. The mention of his brother was a calculated risk, but she needed to shift their focus from the townspeople to her. Below, Sheriff Hawley caught her movement and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The old lawman might not know her true identity, but he recognized an ally when he saw one. He began slowly repositioning his men, understanding her intent to draw fire away from the civilians. "You know what else baking teaches you?" Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly. "The importance of preparation, like keeping your sourdough starter fed." She paused, letting the words sink in, or noticing when someone's been asking too many questions about the bank's schedule. In the street, Abigail from the saloon shifted, uncomfortably. Sarah's meaning was clear. She'd known about the betrayal all along, had been preparing for this moment while appearing to do nothing more threatening than knead dough. "Enough games," Carson snapped. "Show yourself or the girl burns. You've got 10 seconds. Sarah checked her Colt one last time. "Mary," she called out, her voice gentler now. "Remember what I taught you about scones, how they need just the right touch?" The girl's eyes widened with understanding. Sarah had always emphasized the importance of a light touch when making scones. Pressed too hard, and they became tough. Every Saturday, they'd practiced the proper technique, a gentle grip, then a sudden release. 5 seconds, Sarah. "You know, Jake," she said, her voice taking on the quiet tone that old-timers in saloons still spoke of with awe. "There's something else you should know about baking." She rose smoothly, the Winchester seemingly materializing in her hands. "Sometimes you have to know exactly when things are about to explode." At that moment, Mary suddenly went limp in the lieutenant's grip, dropping like a stone, just as Sarah had taught her to release a scone. The giant's surprise lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Sarah's first shot took him high, in the shoulder, spinning him away from the girl. The street erupted in chaos. Carson's men opened fire at her position, but she was already moving. The Winchester sang out twice more, taking down the men nearest the dynamite-laden horses. Sheriff Hawley and his deputies seized the moment, laying down covering fire as Mary scrambled to safety. "Kill her!" Carson's voice rose above the gunfire. "Kill them all!" Sarah's reply was drowned out by a massive explosion, but not from the dynamite. The massive flour storage bin behind Carson's position had somehow been punctured, and a stray spark had found the volatile dust cloud. She'd once seen a similar explosion level 1/2 mile in Kansas. It was amazing, she reflected as she lined up her next shot. How many deadly things could be found in a simple bakery? The flower explosion had turned the street into a war zone, a thick white cloud hanging in the air like mountain fog. Carson's men were scattered, coughing and disoriented, their carefully planned positions thrown into chaos. Sarah moved through, the haze like a ghost, years of muscle memory taking over as she shifted from cover to cover. "Just like old times, isn't it, Jake?" she called out, her voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Though I have to admit, flower clouds are a new twist. Guess I've learned a few tricks in retirement after all." A bullet whined past her head, kicking up splinters from the water trough. Carson's voice followed it, tight with rage. "You always did love to talk during a fight, Sarah, right up until the day you left that family to burn." The accusation stung, but Sarah kept moving. "Is that what you told yourself?" Another shot, another miss. "That I chose revenge over saving them. Truth's a bit more complicated, Jake. Just like that night in Abilene wasn't quite what it seemed." Through the settling flower dust, she caught glimpses of the battle unfolding. Sheriff Hawley had rallied his deputies, using the confusion to push back Carson's men. The townspeople were proving their worth too. She spotted Mr. Henderson from the hardware store, picking off Outlaws with surprising accuracy from his second-floor window. "Sir!" one of Carson's men called out in panic. "The back escape route! Someone's taken out our men! The dynamite's gone!" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. During her years of baking, she'd made friends with every delivery boy and stable. And in town, they knew all the back alleys, all the hidden routes. A few quiet words in the right ears had ensured Carson's escape plan was compromised before he even arrived. "You've gone soft, Sarah." Carson's voice was moving. He was heading for the backup horses. "Time was you'd have shot us all dead by now. Instead, you're playing games with flour and children." "Maybe I learned there's more than one way to fight." Sarah worked her way around the bank's corner, careful to keep her dress from rustling. "Or maybe I just got tired of counting notches on my gun." A sudden movement caught her eye. Abigail from the saloon was trying to slip away in the chaos, a bulging satchel in her hands. Sarah's shot kicked up dirt at her feet, freezing her in place. "Drop it," Sarah ordered quietly, "unless you want to explain to Jake how you lost his share of the bank money." The saloon owner's face twisted in fury, but she let the bag fall. Sarah had suspected for months that Abigail was more than just an informant. The way she handled money at the saloon spoke of someone used to counting larger sums than drink receipts. "You know what your problem is, Sarah?" Carson's voice was closer now, somewhere behind the overturned wagon to her left. "You always thought you were better than the rest of us, the righteous gunslinger, cleaning up the West. But we both know what you really are, a killer who hides behind a badge, or in your case, an apron." "Funny thing about aprons, Jake." Sarah moved silently into position. "They're real good at hiding things, like how the flower explosion wasn't an accident, or how I spent 10 years planning for the day someone from my past would find me." A shot rang out, and Sarah felt the bullet tug at her sleeve. Carson had worked his way behind her. He'd always been clever that way. But she'd been counting his shots, just like she counted minutes while baking. That was his last round. "Time's up, sweet Sarah." Carson stepped into view, already reaching for his backup gun. "Let's finish what started in Dodge." "Oh, Jake," Sarah sighed, her own Colt seeming to materialize in her hand. "You really should have paid more attention in Abilene. A good baker, like a good gunfighter, always keeps something in reserve." The street held its breath as two legends faced each other through the settling flower dust, their shadows long in the morning sun. 10 years of peace hung in the balance against a lifetime of violence, and Sarah knew that whatever happened next would forever change the way Sweetwater Junction saw their quiet baker. The moment stretched like pulled taffy as Sarah and Carson faced each other in the flower-dusted street. To the watching townspeople, it must have seemed impossible that their gentle baker could stand so calmly before a notorious killer. But to Sarah, The familiar tension before a gunfight felt as natural as waiting for dough to rise. "You know what I never understood, Sarah?" Carson's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "Why Dodge City? You had me dead to rights in Abilene. Could have ended it right there. Instead, you let your obsession with catching the whole gang lead you straight into that trap." "Wasn't obsession, Jake." Sarah's eyes never left his gun hand, reading the subtle tells she remembered from their last encounter. "It was justice, the kind you never understood." Through the settling dust, she could see the positions of the remaining players in this deadly game. Sheriff Hawley and his men had Carson's remaining gang members pinned down. Mary had made it, safely to the church, where Reverend Blake was gathering the townspeople. But Carson still had one card to play. She could see it in the slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Justice?" he laughed. "Is that what you call abandoning a family to burn while you chased after us?" Their screams must have been pretty loud to hear them all the way from your perch on the moral high ground. Sarah's voice remained steady, though the old pain flickered in her eyes. "You still don't know what really happened that night, do you, Jake? Too busy running to look back and see the whole picture." A sudden movement caught her attention. One of Carson's men was trying to work his way around behind her through the alley. She ignored him. If Carson had taught her anything in Abilene, it was that the obvious threat usually wasn't the real danger. "Then enlighten me." Carson's hand drifted closer to his gun. "Before I send Sweetwater's favorite baker to meet those poor souls from Dodge." "That family you think I abandoned?" Sarah's fingers flexed near her Colt. "They didn't die in the fire. I got them out through the cellar while my partner kept you boys busy. Had to let you think you'd won, so they'd stay safe. That's why I disappeared, to keep them protected while I hunted down every last member of your gang." Carson's eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise she'd seen from him. "You're lying." "Am I?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Ask your brother about the woman who's been keeping him under surveillance in Mexico, the one who sends him baked goods every Sunday. Their daughter makes the deliveries. She's about Mary's age now." The revelation hit Carson like a physical blow. Sarah saw the moment his composure cracked, saw the fury replace his calculated calm. Behind him, his hidden sharpshooter was finally in position on the hotel roof. Just as she'd planned. "You played me," Carson snarled. "All these years." "No, Jake, I just learned something you never did. Patience. Like waiting for bread to bake, or for a man to reveal his whole plan before you counter it." Carson's eyes narrowed. "Still the same arrogant—" "Now, Sheriff!" Sarah's shout cut through the tension like a knife. Sheriff Hawley's shot rang out from the church tower, taking down the sharpshooter before he could fire. At the same moment, Deputy Turner and his men burst from the alley behind Carson's would-be flanker, their rifles leaving no room for resistance. Carson's draw was lightning fast. She had to give him that. His gun had barely cleared leather, when Sarah's Colt seemed to materialize in her hand, as if it had been there all along. Their shots rang out simultaneously, echoing off the buildings like thunder. Sarah felt Carson's bullet pass through her sleeve, close enough to burn. Her own shot was more precise. Jake Carson, terror of the territories, looked down in surprise at the spreading red stain just below his heart. "Your problem, Jake," Sarah said softly as he fell to his knees, "was thinking that retirement made me slower. Truth is, needing bread for 10 years just made my hands stronger." The silence following the gunshots seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the soft settling of flour dust in the morning air. Carson lay still in the street, his final expression one of mingled surprise and understanding. Around him, his remaining men dropped their weapons, the fight gone out of them at the sight of their fallen leader. Sarah kept her Colt trained on Carson's body, a habit born from hard experience. She'd seen too many dead men make miraculous recoveries to take chances. But Jake Carson wouldn't be adding to his legend anymore. His last shot had been his final one. Miss Sarah?" Mary's voice trembled as she peered out from behind Reverend Blake's protective stance. The girl's flour-dusted face was streaked with tears, but her eyes held more awe than fear. "It's all right, Mary," Sarah replied softly, finally lowering her gun. "Though I suspect today's baking lessons are cancelled." The attempt at normalcy felt strange, like trying to fit into clothes she'd long outgrown. Sheriff Hawley approached cautiously, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Sweet Sarah Hawkins," he said, testing the name like an unfamiliar recipe. "I served with a marshal in Wyoming who used to talk about you. Said you were the fastest gun he'd ever seen, man or woman." That was a lifetime ago, Sheriff. Sarah began checking her weapon with practiced efficiency. "These days, I prefer to measure my success in smiles at fresh bread rather than notches on a gun." Around them, the town was coming back to life. Deputy Turner and his men were securing the prisoners, while Doc Wilson hurried from person to person, checking for injuries. The morning sun had burned away most of the flour haze, revealing the full extent of the battle's aftermath. "You knew, didn't you?" Abigail spoke up from where she sat under guard, her fine dress now coated in street dust. "All those months I was asking questions, gathering information for Jake, you were watching me right back." Sarah nodded, her eyes taking on a distant look. "First rule of surveillance, watch who watches you. You asked too many questions about the bank's schedule, but never once wanted to know about my apple pie recipe. In my experience, everyone wants that recipe." A laugh rippled through the gathering crowd, breaking some of the tension. But Sarah could see the questions in their eyes. The way they looked at her differently now, the peaceful life she'd built was transforming before her eyes, like dough under the heat of an oven. "The family from Dodge City," Hawley said quietly, moving closer. "You really saved them?" "The Pattersons," Sarah confirmed, her voice soft with memory. "Mary and John, their daughter Emma. Got them out through the root cellar while my partner Pete drew Carson's fire. Set it up to look like they died in the blaze." She paused, checking her sleeve where Carson's final bullet had passed through. "Had to disappear after that, make it convincing. Carson's gang had too many eyes, too many connections. Only way to keep them safe was to let the legend of Sweet Sarah die in that fire. And you've been tracking them ever since? Carson's gang? Among other things." Sarah gestured to her shop, where the morning's abandoned bread still waited in the ovens. "Turns out baking is a surprisingly good cover for gathering information. People talk freely in a bakery. Stories spread like warm butter if you know how to listen." Mary had worked up the courage to approach, her small hand slipping into Sarah's flour-dusted one. "Is that why you always said timing was the most important thing? You weren't just talking about baking, were you?" Sarah squeezed the girl's hand gently. "Timing is everything, child, whether you're waiting for bread to rise or for justice to be served." She looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people who'd known her only as their quiet baker until today. Though I have to admit, I never planned on serving both at the same time. The next few hours in Sweetwater Junction passed in a blur of activity. The undertaker, Mr. Simmons, handled Carson's body with professional detachment, while Deputy Turner organized a wagon train to transport the surviving gang members to the territorial prison. Throughout it all, Sarah moved with the same quiet efficiency she brought to her baking, helping tend to the wounded and repair the damage to her adopted home. "The bank money's all accounted for," Sheriff Hawley announced, emerging from the vault where he'd been counting with the bank manager, "though I suspect we'll be finding flour in the corners for months to come." "Could be worse," Sarah replied, helping board up a broken window. "Could have been the cinnamon. That stuff gets everywhere and it never quite comes out." The attempt at normal conversation felt strange, like trying to speak two languages at once. Word of the morning's events was already spreading. The telegraph operator had been busy sending messages to every major town in the territory, and Sarah knew It was only a matter of time before her peaceful retirement became front-page news from Denver to Dallas. U.S. Marshal's office will want to talk to you, Hawley said quietly, falling into step beside her as she walked back to her shop. Carson had a federal price on his head, $20,000. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Split it between your town's repair fund and the sheriff's office, though I'd appreciate if you'd set aside a small sum to replace my flour supplies. Good baking flour isn't cheap these days. The sheriff's weathered face cracked into a smile. Only you would worry about flour inventory after a gunfight like that. His expression grew serious. But what about you? Way I hear it, there's still quite a few bounties out there with Sweet Sarah's name on them. Might be some old enemies thinking about paying us a visit. Let them come, Mary's voice piped up. The girl had been following them, still unwilling to let Sarah out of her sight. Miss Sarah can handle them. She's the fastest gun in Montana. Mary Cooper. Sarah's voice carried the same stern tone she used for improper kneading techniques. Being quick with a gun isn't something to celebrate. It's a burden, like carrying a hot pan without mitts, sometimes necessary but never pleasant. Inside, the bakery, the morning's abandoned work, waited like an interrupted dream. Half-shaped loaves had risen too long, and the scent of slightly burned cookies filled the air. Sarah moved through the familiar space, aware of how different it felt now that her secrets were exposed. "You know," Mrs. Henderson said from the doorway, where a small crowd of townspeople had gathered, "this explains why your coffee cake always had such a kick to it. I thought it was just extra cinnamon, but it was gunpowder all along, wasn't it?" The tension broke as laughter rippled through the crowd. Sarah found herself smiling despite everything. These people had known her for years as their baker, and, while the revelation of her true identity had shocked them, they were choosing to accept both sides of her with surprising grace. "I suppose I owe you all some explanations," she said, brushing flour from her apron, "or was it gunsmoke?" After the morning's excitement, it was hard to tell. "But first, these ovens won't clean themselves, and I've got tomorrow's bread to think about." "You're staying then?" Reverend Blake asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "Even with everything that's happened?" Sarah looked around at the shop she'd built, at the faces of people who'd become more than just customers. She thought of the Patterson family in Mexico, still safe after all these years, and of young Mary, who'd shown such courage under fire. "Way I see it," she said finally, reaching for her rolling pin with the same confidence she'd handled her Colt, "a good baker never abandons bread in the oven. Besides," she allowed herself a small smile, "I've spent 10 years perfecting my sourdough starter. Be ashamed to start over somewhere else." The truth was, she realized as she began cleaning up the morning's chaos, Sweetwater Junction had become more than just a hiding place. Like a well-proofed dough, she'd finally found the perfect spot to rise, to become something more than what she'd been before. By sunset, Sweetwater Junction had settled into an uneasy calm. The prisoners were secured in the jail, the dead had been seen to, and the streets were mostly clear of flour dust. But change hung in the air like the scent of fresh-baked bread, impossible to ignore and irreversible once started. Sarah stood in her kitchen, methodically preparing the next day's starter. The familiar motions helped steady her hands, which hadn't shaken during the gunfight, but trembled now as the full weight of the day's events settled over her. Her peaceful life of 10 years had been transformed in a single morning, like dough shaped by experienced hands. "Got a telegram from the territorial marshal," Sheriff Hawley said, entering through the back door, a liberty he'd never taken before today. "They're sending a special deputy to interview you about Carson's gang. Seems you might know things about their operation that could help bring in the rest of them." Sarah nodded, not looking up from her work. "His brothers still out there, and at least 3 lieutenants who weren't with him today. They'll need to be dealt with before they try to reorganize." "That's not your responsibility anymore," Hawley reminded her gently. "Isn't it?" She finally met his eyes. I let them slip away in Dodge City, chose saving lives over ending their threat. Everything they've done since then, that weight sits on my shoulders too. A noise from the front of the shop interrupted them. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her Colt before she recognized Mary's distinctive knock. The girl had appointed herself unofficial guardian of the bakery, turning away the curious and the sensation-seekers who'd begun arriving from neighboring towns. Miss Sarah, Mary entered, followed by her father, Wesley Cooper. Pa wants to talk to you about something important. Wesley shuffled uncomfortably, his hat in his hands. Miss Sarah, or should I say Miss Hawkins, the town council had an emergency meeting this afternoon about your situation. Sarah's hands stilled in their work. She'd been expecting this. Small towns had their own ways of dealing with change, and not all of them were gentle. Some folks were concerned, Wesley continued, about having a former gunfighter in town, worried it might bring trouble, affect property values, that sort of thing. I understand, Sarah said quietly, though her heart ached at the thought of leaving her adopted home. I can have the shop closed by— Now hold on, Wesley interrupted, a slight smile playing at his lips. Let me finish. The other folks pointed out that having the legendary Sweet Sarah as our resident baker might actually be good for business. And more importantly, he glanced at his daughter, who was practically bouncing with excitement. We've never felt safer than knowing you were watching over things all this time. What your long-winded father is trying to say, Mary burst in, unable to contain herself any longer, is that the council voted to make you the official town protector. Working with Sheriff Hawley, of course. Sarah blinked in surprise. Official and town protector? Makes sense, Hawley said, amusement clear in his voice. You can keep baking, keep teaching Mary her tricks, both kinds now, I suppose, and help keep an eye on things, especially with word getting out about Carson's defeat. Might be some other old enemies coming to call. Besides, Wesley added, way Mary tells it, your baking lessons involve a fair bit of wisdom about timing, patience, and precision. Seems to me those are good skills for any young person to learn, regardless of whether they're applying them to bread or other situations. Sarah looked at their hopeful faces, feeling the weight of the moment. They weren't just offering her a job, they were offering acceptance, understanding, a chance to merge both sides of her life into something new. One condition, she said finally, allowing herself to smile. Nobody gets to call me Sweet Sarah anymore. I worked hard to build a reputation as the best baker in 3 territories, and I'd like to keep it that way. Deal, Hawley agreed, then added with a grin, though I might need some of those famous cinnamon rolls as part of my official morning reports. Speaking of which, Mary piped up, eyeing the oven hopefully. I don't suppose any of this morning's batch survived the excitement. Sarah laughed, her first genuine laugh since Carson's arrival, and reached for her rolling pin. Tell you what, help me clean up this mess, and I'll teach you my secret recipe. Both of them. The next morning brought changes to Sweetwater Junction that nobody could have predicted. Sarah's morning routine remained the same. She still rose before dawn to start her ovens and prepare the day's goods. But now her customers watched, with fascinated attention, as she shaped loaves with the same precise movements she'd used to handle her Colt. Always wondered why your knife work was so exact, Mrs. Thompson commented, watching Sarah slice bread with fluid efficiency. Guess you learned that skill long before you started baking. Actually, Sarah replied, wrapping the loaf in brown. In paper, baking taught me more about knife work than gunfighting ever did. There's an art to getting the right angle, just like there's an art to everything else. The morning brought other visitors too. 3 young men from the sheriff's office in neighboring Silver Creek had ridden in, ostensibly to help transport Carson's gang to the territorial prison. But Sarah noticed how they lingered at her counter, ordering coffee and pastries while stealing glances at her hands. Ma'am, The boldest of them finally spoke up. "Is it true what they say about that shootout in Abilene? They say you took down 5 men without reloading." Sarah continued kneading her dough, her movements never faltering. "Young man, do you know what makes a perfect loaf of bread? It's not just the ingredients or the technique. It's knowing when to work the dough and when to let it rest." She looked up, meeting his eager eyes with a stern gaze. "Same principle applies to stories about the past. Some need working, some need resting." The young deputy blushed and turned his attention back to his coffee. But Sarah noticed Mary, sweeping nearby, soaking in every word with the same attention. She gave to baking lessons. "Miss Sarah," the girl asked later as they prepared for the lunch rush, "why don't you ever talk about your gunfighting days? Are you ashamed of them?" Sarah paused in her work, considering the question carefully. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Hawley making his morning rounds, nodding to the townsfolk who now looked at their small community with new pride, home of the baker who'd outshot Jake Carson. "Not ashamed, Mary, just careful. Stories about violence have a way of rising like bad yeast. They can overtake everything else if you let them. I'd rather be known for creating than destroying." A commotion outside drew their attention. A fancy carriage had pulled up, and a well-dressed man was stepping down, followed by a photographer with his bulky equipment. Sarah recognized the logo. On the carriage, the territorial newspaper. "Miss Hawkins," the reporter called out, already heading for her door. "The public wants to know the truth about Sweet Sarah. How many men have you really killed? What happened in Dodge City? Is it true you once shot a man's gun right out of his hand at 50 paces? Before Sarah could respond, Mary was at the door, blocking it with the authority of a seasoned deputy. "Miss Sarah's busy with the lunch bread right now, and it's Miss Mitchell, not Hawkins. If you want an interview, you'll have to make an appointment and buy something. The sourdough's especially good today." Sarah smiled at the girl's protective instinct. She'd taught Mary well, in more ways than one. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Hawley and Deputy Turner moving to intercept the reporter, explaining the town's new policy about respecting their baker's privacy. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, watching the scene unfold, "there's something I learned during my riding days that applies perfectly to baking. Want to hear it?" Mary nodded eagerly, always ready for another lesson that bridged Sarah's two worlds. "The most dangerous moment in any conflict isn't when you're facing down an enemy," Sarah explained, checking the rising loaves with practiced eye. "It's when you think the fight is over. That's when you get careless, forget to watch the little details." "Like how bread can fall if you don't watch it after it comes out of the oven?" Mary asked, catching on quickly. "Exactly. Carson's gone, but his brother's still out there, and now that my secret's out—" Sarah trailed off, her eyes scanning the street with professional attention. "Well, let's just say we'll need to be extra careful with our timing, both in baking and in watching." A week after Carson's defeat, Sarah received 2 letters that proved her instincts about watching and waiting had been right. The first came from Emma Patterson, the girl she'd saved in Dodge City, now a young woman helping coordinate her network of informants throughout the territories. The second arrived under the counter of a delivery wagon, carried by one of her many quiet allies from the old days. "Tom Carson's gathering men," she told Sheriff Hawley that evening, as they sat in her kitchen reviewing the information. "His brother's death hit him hard. He's calling in every favor, hiring every gun he can find." "How many?" Hawley asked, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. "According to Emma, at least 30 so far. And these aren't common bandits. They're professionals, men with reputations of their own." Sarah poured more coffee, the familiar aroma mixing with the lingering scent of the day's baking. "They're coming, Sheriff. Not just for me, but for the whole town. Tom always was the more vengeful of the brothers. Mary, who'd been pretending to clean nearby while eavesdropping, couldn't contain herself any longer. But you'll stop them, won't you, Miss Sarah?" Like you stopped Jake Carson? Sarah exchanged a look with Hawley. They both knew that 30 experienced gunmen was a far different proposition than the dozen or so they'd faced before. But looking at Mary's trusting face, Sarah found herself unwilling to extinguish that faith. Remember what I taught you about preparing for a big order, Mary? How you have to plan ahead, get everything ready. The girl nodded eagerly. Well, that's what we're going to do now. Plan and prepare. Over the next few days, Sweetwater Junction transformed once again. Under Sarah's guidance, the town became a carefully prepared battlefield. Every alley, every rooftop, every possible approach was considered and accounted for. The locals, now fiercely protective of their baker-turned-protector, threw themselves into the preparations. It's not just about guns, Sarah explained to Deputy Turner as they surveyed their work. It's about making them fight on our terms, in our territory. Just like baking, you control the conditions, you control the outcome. The town's children became lookouts, playing elaborate games that just happened to keep watch on every approach to town. The women's sewing circle transformed into an intelligence network, sharing news from travelers and tracking suspicious movements. Even old Mr. Henderson's hardware store underwent subtle changes, its inventory shifting to include items that could serve double duty in a fight. But it was Mary who surprised Sarah the most. The girl had taken to her new role as apprentice in both baking and surveillance with remarkable aptitude. She developed a system of signals using different types of bread displayed in the window: sourdough for strangers in town, rye for suspicious. Activity, wheat for all clear. You're teaching her your trade, Hawley observed one morning, watching Mary coordinate with the other children. Both trades, actually. She deserves to know, Sarah replied, checking the placement of extra ammunition, hidden throughout her shop. Knowledge is like yeast. It grows best when shared properly. The telegram arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a breathless Wesley Cooper. Riders spotted 20 miles out, he reported, moving fast, well armed. They'll be here by dawn. Sarah took the news with the same calm she showed when judging a loaf's readiness. Then it's time to start our final preparations. Mary, remember what I said about the most important ingredient in any recipe? Timing, the girl answered promptly. Exactly. And tomorrow morning we're going to serve Tom Carson something his brother never quite understood. A lesson in patience, preparation, and the proper way to handle rising trouble. As sunset painted the mountains gold, Sarah stood in her kitchen, simultaneously preparing the next morning's dough and checking her weapons. The familiar motions of both activities blended together, two parts of her life finally working in perfect harmony. You know what the secret is to both baking and gunfighting? She asked Mary, who was helping with the preparations. It's not about being the fastest or the strongest. It's about being ready when the moment comes, because whether it's bread or bullets, timing is everything. Dawn broke over Sweetwater Junction like the opening of a hot oven, golden light spilling across the quiet streets. Sarah stood in her bakery, the morning's bread already baked and cooling. She'd been up since midnight, preparing in more ways than one. Her Colt rested comfortably on her hip, while fresh loaves lined her shelves, their aroma mixing with the crisp morning air. "Riders coming," Mary reported from her watching post, her voice steady despite the tension. "Just like you said, they're splitting up, trying to surround the town." Sarah nodded, proud of her apprentice's calm observation. "And what else do you see?" "They're being careful, too careful." Mary's eyes narrowed. "They're so busy watching. For traps? They're not seeing the real surprise." "Just like when you're too worried about burning the bread," Sarah agreed. "You forget to check if it's risen properly." She moved to the window, scanning the approaching riders with professional assessment. Tom Carson rode at their head, his resemblance to his late brother striking. But where Jake had been cold calculation, Tom radiated raw fury. The town appeared deserted, every window shuttered, every door closed. But Sarah knew better. Behind those shutters, the townspeople waited with rifles ready. Above the streets, carefully concealed lookouts tracked every movement, and in the center of it all, the Morning Star Bakery stood like a beacon, its fresh bread smell a deliberate provocation. "Sweet Sarah," Tom Carson's voice boomed across the empty street. "Come on out, time to answer for my brother." Sarah stepped onto her porch, her movement unhurried. She carried a basket of fresh rolls, steam still rising from their golden crusts. "Morning, Tom. Coffee's hot if you'd care for breakfast before all this unpleasantness." Her casual tone threw him off balance. She could see it in his stance. He'd expected bravado or fear, not this calm invitation to share bread. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily in their saddles. "You think this is a joke?" Tom snarled. "I've brought 30 of the deadliest men in the territory." 28. Sarah corrected mildly. 2 turned back at Miller's Creek last night. Seems my reputation for hospitality isn't what it used to be. She set the basket down, the domestic gesture at odds with the tension in the air. "Last chance, Tom. Ride away. There's been enough killing." "Like you killed Jake?" His hand tightened on his gun. "He told me about you, about Dodge City. How you let a family burn while chasing glory." "That's funny," a new voice called out. All eyes turned to see a woman stepping out of the telegraph office, rifle ready. "I seem to remember those events differently." Tom Carson's face went pale. "Emma Patterson," he whispered. "The same," Emma confirmed. "The girl your gang tried to burn alive. Miss Sarah saved us that night, kept us safe all these years, and now—" She smiled, and there was steel in it. "Now I'm returning the favor." It happened fast after that. Carson's men, already uneasy, found themselves caught in the same kind of trap Jake had fallen into. Every window suddenly bristled with rifles. Every alley held deputies and volunteers. Even the children played their part, their practiced games having mapped every possible escape route. "You see, Tom," Sarah said, quietly, her hands still nowhere near her gun. "A town's like a good loaf of bread. All the ingredients have to work together. And Sweetwater Junction, well, we've been proofing this recipe for quite a while." Carson's draw was fast. Family tradition, perhaps. But Sarah had been right about timing being everything. His bullet struck the doorframe where she'd been standing, while her own shot, fired almost casually, sent his gun spinning away. The fight was brief, almost anticlimactic. Carson's men, facing a prepared town, united behind their baker protector, chose survival over loyalty. Within minutes, it was over. "You'll always be a killer," Tom spat as Hawley's deputies led him away. "No amount of baking can change that." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, picking up her basket of rolls. "But I'd rather be known for what I create than what I destroy. Speaking of which," she turned to the gathered townspeople emerging from their positions, "breakfast is served, though I'm afraid the coffee might be a bit strong. Been brewing since midnight." The laughter that swept through the crowd carried more than just relief. It was the sound of a town embracing its unique protector, of a community that had learned to take both the sweet and the deadly in stride. "Miss Sarah?" Mary tugged at her apron. "Does this mean lessons can go back to normal now?" Sarah smiled, holstering her gun with the same care she used in handling her most delicate pastries. "Normal? No, I think we'll be working on some new recipes from now on. After all," she winked at Emma Patterson, who was already sharing stories with the fascinated townsfolk,